The call to preach or teach the gospel must come from God. No human being can give you a calling. Yes, there are institutions, there's education, there's trainings that you may go through, but that call and that authority to preach has to come from God. And when we're going through our Christian journey, it is so important that we follow people who are called by God and who are not called for a self-serving reason. And as I talked about, we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, there are so many false doctrines out there. That's why it is so important to study the Word of God, because when you know the Word of God and God is touching your soul, trying to save you, there will be a connection to the gospel of Jesus Christ being preached from someone who has been called. So that is so important. And even those of you who are in ministry, make sure that you are moving as a result of a call from the Lord. You know, sometimes preaching or teaching can seem glamorous because you're up in front of the people and because you have an audience and there may be a certain level of popularity associated with it. But there is a life that needs to go behind that. There needs to be some fasting. There needs to be some praying. There needs to be some sacrifice. And above all, there has to be a divine calling on your life if you're going to preach or teach the Word of God. Once again, it is so good to have you here with me at the Sanctuary Sunday School. So glad that you are here. And you probably noticed last week I launched a new segment called Between the Lessons. That was something that I felt led to do because I wanted to share more about Holy Week. I'll be doing that more as I'm led to do so based on how much information we have to share. And I appreciate the input, the feedback, and the acceptance of that. And also, we are in the middle of this April Spring Revival, 30 videos under 30 seconds for 30 days. And God is truly blessing. Go ahead. That's at the website, www.thesanctuary.academy. Go ahead and go to the site. You can join in and go back and catch up, or you can keep going and just go from 30 days for here. But it's just a wonderful thing to take out time to revive your soul. This week's subject is the source of Paul's gospel. And as I've said before, I love the Apostle Paul. He is so strong in his teaching. He does not back down from anything. And in true Paul fashion, he jumps right in. And he said, do I preach to please man or do I preach to please God? Because if I'm preaching to please man, in so many words, I'm not even fit to preach. That right there, you can close the book. That's a lesson right there, because that is such a powerful message for anyone who is preaching or teaching. And it may sound simple and to the point, but a lot of us miss that point. And it's very easy in a church setting to get distracted by trying to please people and trying to say what people want to say, trying to preach a certain way. You know, I grew up in a Kojic church, and it's a very live church, and I love my church. And the thing about that is there's a lot of what they call hooping. Well, hooping is not my style. And I learned a long time ago that if I get into the pulpit and I try to squall or hoop, as they call it, then I'm going to fall flat on my face. That's not the delivery that God gave me. So when you are ministering or teaching or doing whatever it is that you are called to do in church, do it the way that God gave you to do it. And the other part of my testimony is this. I decided I would just come into the studio and I would talk about the Word of God in the best way that I know how. And I'm thinking maybe, 50 to 100 people might tune in a week, and that would have been all right with me. But at this point, we're averaging 11 and 12,000 people every single week. And that's what I'm telling you. There is something that God gave you to do. And if you do whatever it is that God called you to do to please God, not to please man, not to serve yourself, then it will always be blessed. And this is what Paul is talking about. And he said, I'm not trying to please man. And he said, and I'm not trying to please man because my gospel didn't come from man. My gospel came straight from God. And as you know, Paul is one of the apostles, but he was not one of the 12 that walked with Jesus. Paul was converted on the road to Damascus by the Lord himself, and he was called. And after his conversion, Paul did not go and officially get a license or get ordained. Paul went out into Arabia, into the desert somewhere by himself, off on his own, and he just started to preach this radical doctrine and preaching himself, and he was so bold with it. And to the extent that Paul became a testimony, because the people who were the Christians, they're like, okay, this is that guy. Because remember, before he was Paul, he was Saul, and he was under the authority of the government to go and persecute and kill the Christians. And God himself stopped him and said, Paul, what are you doing? Why persecutest thou me? And Paul said, what? Who art thou, Lord? And he wanted to know the Lord, and the Lord revealed himself to him. And as we know, Paul went on to be a powerful missionary, drawing people to the Lord, drawing people from all different countries, because he's known as a preacher to the heathens, to the Gentiles. And yes, Paul was Jewish. He had a Jewish citizenship. He had a dual citizenship, both Roman and Jewish, but he was Jewish. But he preached to everybody, and he spoke 7 languages, and God used him in that way. When we speak of Paul being Jewish, I love this part because he told them, he said, I know more about our customs and our traditions than most of my peers, the people that I'm equal with. He said, so it's not like I didn't go through the traditional customs and traditions because I wasn't good enough or because I didn't know enough. It's that I went and did what God called me specifically to do. I went to the places where God sent me to go. But I am qualified and I am verified. I am validated. I am justified by the Lord himself. And I love that, because we have to be so careful when it comes to the gospel that we don't get caught up in religion more so than salvation and doing everything the way that it's always been done. There's sometimes you got to shake it up a little bit. And that's what Paul did, which is why I love him. And when you also look at that and the different customs and traditions, and he said, I went out on my own and I was gone for 3 years. When I came back, and he came back and he met with Peter. And so that's the indication that Paul did not meet with Peter for Peter to instruct him or teach him. Because first of all, I had been preaching 3 years. And secondly, I was only with Peter for 15 days. That wasn't enough time to teach me. He was just there for a fellowship. And he said the only apostles that he's ever met was Peter and also James, the brother of Jesus. So God told Paul what he needed to do and told him where he needed to go. So this is something that was very important, and Paul understood that. And I thought it was very interesting that he would mention the meeting of Peter and Paul, because as we know, Peter struggled with prejudice and he was calling things unclean. And Jesus, the Lord had to check him and say, look, you can't call anything unclean that I call unclean. So we have Peter who, he was very into the Jewish way and didn't really want to deal with Gentiles. And then we have Paul, who was the missionary to the Gentiles, and how God, the power, and the gospel brought these 2 men together. And I love that, because within the church today, we have so many divisions, and we want to condemn people because they're not worshiping the way that we worship. But that's not what this word is saying. This word is saying that there is one gospel, and it doesn't matter where you're preaching or who you're preaching to. You need to be preaching the same thing, because at the end of the day, we're all trying to go to the same place, and that is to be with the Lord. So when we speak of the source of Paul's gospel, his source was the Lord. And that is the lesson for today. Make sure that your source is Jesus. It's okay to have the support of your pastor or the bishop or whomever. It's okay if you have whatever position. Those things are fine. But make sure that your source is God, that it is God who has called you, that it's God that is speaking to you. And above all, that whatever you teach, whatever you preach, or whatever you say is in alignment with the Word of God.